The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for attending this important oversight hearing on the congressionally mandated International Religious Freedom Report and designations of countries of particular concern for 2011. This is the first oversight hearing on the IRFA report since I chaired a hearing on the 2006 report in December of that year. It is one of a series being held by this subcommittee that is examining the critically important issue of religious freedom. In June of this year, we held a hearing on prioritizing international religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy in the context of amending the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, also known as IRFA. We also examined freedom of conscience and religion in the context of China's and North Korean overall abysmal human rights records. A study conducted by Dr. Brian Grimm of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, who testified before our subcommittee in June, found that almost 70% of the world's population lives in countries with high or very high restrictions on religion. Although this study was conducted between 2006 and 2009, it was apparent back in the late 1990s that the fundamental human rights of religious freedom was under severe attack around the world. Congress gave expression to our commitment to international religious freedom with the passage in 1998 of IRFA, which concretely established the promotion and protection of religious liberties as a serious foreign policy goal. I was shocked at the time when IRFA was strongly opposed on the record by the Clinton administration. John Shattuck, then the former Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, claimed right here in this room at that witness table that it would establish a hierarchy of human rights under U.S. law, and therefore they opposed it. I chaired the hearings on the legislation, and I, as well as others, pointed out that, for example, when we fought against apartheid and enacted laws to mitigate the abomination of racism in South Africa, we certainly did not detract from other human rights policies. Instead, it was always value added. Similarly, when we took up the cause of Soviet Jewry, and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was employed with such effectiveness to help release refuseniks, and even risking superpower confrontation in order to release Soviet Jews who were being harassed and persecuted in the former Soviet Union. It did not detract from any of our other human rights laws. It was not a hierarchy of human rights. It was all value added. In like manner, the International Religious Freedom Act was an important, and I would say historic, addition to the overall effort to defend and promote human rights by focusing the spotlight on one of the most fundamental of all human rights. We persisted, and eventually the bill, authored by my good friend and colleague Frank Wolf of Virginia, was signed into law. A critical component of the law is the requirement that the State Department review foreign countries each year and submit a report on the status of religious freedom to Congress. Those countries found to be engaged in or tolerating particularly severe violations of religious freedom during the preceding 12 months are to be designated as countries of particular concern, or CPC countries. In September, the Department of State issued its report for the last 6 months of 2010. The reason for the abbreviated report is to introduce a new reporting cycle that will be based on the calendar year instead of the previous July to June reporting period. The State Department also notified Congress in September that 8 countries have been redesignated as CPCs: Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. These are the same 8 countries that previously have been designated by the Bush administration on January 16th of 2009. Pursuant to the IRFA Act, the Secretary must impose new presidential actions and impose them, issue waivers, or authorize an additional 90-day extension for such actions against these 8 countries by December 12th. I and other members of Congress are strongly urging the administration not to double hat sanctions against these countries, as has been done previously, but to impose measures that have some teeth and that are likely to produce the desired results. Any thoughts from our witnesses about what actions should be taken would be both timely and would be most appreciated. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom recommended several additional countries be added to that list. They include Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Vietnam. I will also be interested in hearing from our witnesses as to whether they agree with the Commission that any or all of these countries should be CPC countries. Just 2 days ago, I chaired a hearing of the Helsinki Commission on the horrific plight of Coptic Christians in Egypt. In July, the Foreign Affairs Committee accepted 2 religious freedom amendments that I proposed to the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, or H.R. 2583. One calls on the administration to include the protection of Coptic Christian communities as a priority in our diplomatic engagements with the government of Egypt, and the other prohibits increased non-humanitarian assistance to Vietnam until its government makes substantial progress toward respecting the right to freedom of religion, among other requirements. Rather, what they are doing now, which is serious regression. I was also deeply disturbed by the assassination of Pakistan's Federal Minister of Minorities, as we all were, joined several people on this subcommittee and throughout the House, including Frank Wolf and so many other members, when Shahbaz Abadi, on March 12th of this year, died by assassination. I had met personally on a number of occasions with Minister Abadi when he visited Washington, D.C., and was extremely inspired, encouraged, and really awed by his courage and by his commitment to promote the rights of religious minorities and harmony among all faiths in his country. His killing was a tragic loss for all Pakistanis, and the ongoing failure of the Pakistani government to identify his assassins and bring them to justice is an ongoing violation of respect for the religious freedom. In closing, I would like to note that the State Department's Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Dr. Suzanne Johnson Cook, was invited to testify at this hearing and present the report written by her office. Unfortunately, the State Department refused to allow her to appear without another State Department official on her panel. Given the important responsibilities assigned to the Ambassador at Large, pursuant to the IRFA Act, including advancing the right to religious freedom abroad through diplomatic representations on behalf of the United States, our subcommittee looks forward to the opportunity to hear from Ambassador Johnson Cook when she's allowed to testify on her own. And I would point out parenthetically that time and again, in this room again, we've had the Ambassador at Large sit right there and give a worldview, country-specific view as to what the administration, be it the Bush it was the Bush administration, as to what they were doing in the last year of the Clinton administration to advance fundamental human rights relative to religious freedom. We hope that Ambassador Johnson Cook will be here at some point. I now yield to my friend Donald Payne, the ranking member.
Thank you very much, and let me begin by thanking Chairman Smith for calling this hearing on the State Department's 2011 International Religious Freedom Report. This hearing follows a June hearing on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF 2011 report. I would like to thank our distinguished witnesses for being here today to shine light on religious freedom injustices throughout the world. Mr. Leo, you testified at the hearing as well at that time, and I thank you for agreeing to return again. According to the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life, the majority of the world's population, some 70%, live under high or very high restrictions on religious practice. Some 2.2 billion people live in nations where government restrictions or social hostilities are increasing. The combination of religious discrimination, political exclusion, and social unrest is dangerous for conflict and extremist groups, which often thrive under such circumstances by exploiting the grievances of disenfranchised religious minorities. Many times they do not really have true concerns about the problem. However, they move in to exploit the situation, and that creates a difficult situation. Take Nigeria, where the nebulous Islamic extremist group Boko Haram has become increasingly active. This August, for the first time, the group attacked a Western target, the UN building in Abuja. This week, Nigeria's President, Goodluck Jonathan, announced a special security fund to help the military tackle Boko Haram. However, to successfully limit the group's recruitment base, social development and interfaith dialogue must be a priority. We know that Nigeria's interreligious tensions stem from a myriad of non-religious civilian grievances against the government, including the lack of basic social services, inadequate distribution of wealth, corruption, and laws that allow discrimination in various areas, including employment and political participation, based on whether an individual is considered to be a native or a settler in a given geographic area. The addendum to the 2011 State Department report cites an example of a property dispute which ignited clashes between Muslims and Christians, leaving 96 dead. And so we see people move in to exploit some of the problems that the government have left unanswered. Interfaith conflict resolutions and traditional community-based mediation mechanisms are key to addressing these tensions, but the Nigerian government will need to do more through development and improved governance to tackle the root causes of grievances in the same way that they instituted initiatives in their government to successfully target human trafficking, making Nigeria, on one hand, the only African nation ranked as a Tier 1 country in the 2011 Trafficking in Persons report. The Nigerian government can also use innovative approaches to address this challenge. On one hand, extremely successful, really have made tremendous strides. We heard that in a recent hearing that we had. Tier 1, which is unusual for many of the developing countries in Africa. But in religious persecution, we find just the opposite. So somehow we've got to be able to translate the same interests that we have in that area into this. As Dr. Smith points out in his testimony, many of the most atrocious violators of religious freedom are also the most authoritarian and oppressed dictators. In Sudan, Bashir's attempt to severely restrict religious freedom were among the factors that fueled the country's decade-long civil war between the North and the South. 4 million people displaced, 2 million people died since 1989 when the conflict began. I was in Juba at the joyful celebration of South Sudan's independence this summer. However, since then there have been numerous clashes on the border areas. Adding to his laundry list of gross human rights violations against his own people, Bashir continues to impose Sharia law on Sudan's citizens and continue to discriminate against non-Muslims. I look forward to hearing from our panelists about how the United States and the international community can work to improve interfaith conflict resolutions in countries like Sudan by supporting U.S. and indigenous peace-building institutions. The United States Institute of Peace is making great strides in this area, yet not everyone in Congress believes that investing in peace building is better than taking a military approach, and the organization's funding is currently in jeopardy. For example, USIP's Religious and Peacemaking Center is promoting interfaith dialogue and mediation in combat zones. The center announced a 2006 study, authored a 2006 study, which demonstrated that military chaplains, as clergy and officers, are well suited to serve as intermediaries between military and religious leaders in the area of conflict and post-conflict stabilization. A recent article in the Atlantic magazine highlighted the story of a naval chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Nathan Solomon, an Afghan Army captain, and Mullah Abdul Kabar. The two sought to refute Taliban propaganda about Afghan soldiers and improve relations with the locals. Through both dialogue and service, the two managed to bring together local citizens and religious leaders from various tribes to discuss the negative forces that the Taliban is having on both Islam and Afghanistan. The article closes with Solomon, the non-combatant, had perhaps shaped the battlefield as powerfully as any bullet fired or bomb dropped across Afghanistan that particular day. These innovative approaches are important in fighting religious persecution and resolving religious conflict globally. And we cannot focus on defending the rights of only one or two religions when promoting religious tolerance. People of all faiths, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, and all the rest deserve equal rights to practice their faith without persecution. I look forward to our discussion on how USCIRF is working to protect the rights of all faiths, as well as hearing from our second panel of experts about how to improve U.S. programs aimed at eliminating religious persecution and promoting interfaith conflict resolution. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Mr. Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no comment.
Okay. Mr. Carnahan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Payne for holding this hearing about the State Department's International Religious Freedom Report. This really is an important part of the human rights jurisdiction of this subcommittee, so I appreciate the focus that's being given to this topic. And I really hope we can shed light on this serious human rights infringements that far too many around the world encounter. We've heard the dawning statistics. An estimated 6.8 billion people, 70% of the world's population, live under high restrictions on religious activity. In countries around the world, minority religious groups are targets, often of state-sanctioned repression, while others go so far as providing safe havens for violent extremism or suppressing religious expression virtually writ large. Evidence shows the U.S. has a strong interest in promoting religious freedom globally. As with other indicators of democracy and human rights, nations that respect religious tolerance generally enjoy greater economic prosperity and social stability. I look forward to hearing from our panelists on these trends, along with their recommendations of the most strategic and effective means for the U.S. and the international community to influence governing systems to respect all human rights, including religious freedom, and foster attitudes of greater tolerance around the world. I'm especially interested in how we might strengthen our efforts to support interfaith dialogue and public diplomacy tools that promote religious freedom. In closing, I'd like to thank the panelists for their testimony and their time and expertise that you bring to bear today. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carnahan. I'd like to now welcome to the witness table Mr. Leonard A. Leo, who serves as Executive Vice President of the Federalist Society, but he's here today as the Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and has served as Commissioner for USIF since 2007. The Commission was created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 and has the legislative mandate to review the facts and circumstances of religious freedom violations presented in the administration's human rights and international religious freedom reports, and to make policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress with respect to international religious freedom matters. Mr. Leo is a prolific author, has published several articles on religious liberty under the U.S. Constitution. Among his many activities, he has served as U.S. delegate to the UN Commission on Human Rights and is involved with the U.S. National Commission to the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Mr. Leo received his undergraduate degree with high honors from Cornell University in 1987 and his law degree from Cornell Law School with honors in 1989. Mr. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to be here. We're very grateful, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on these issues involving the preservation of freedom of religion around the world. Mr. Payne, it's nice to see you again. We had a wonderful conversation about a number of African countries during the last hearing. and we're very grateful for your leadership in that area, in Sudan and Nigeria, as you mentioned, and a number of other countries. And we're, as a commission, always interested in talking with you about your experiences in that part of the world where we've been spending a lot of our time and attention. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to have the full content of my testimony entered into the record.
Without
I'll give a
objection, so
redacted
ordered.
version. Well, again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Payne and members of the committee, on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, I'm grateful for today's opportunity to testify about the State Department's 2011 annual report on international religious freedom, or the IRF report as it's known, and the critical role of the legislative and executive branches and USCIRF in promoting religious freedom abroad. Religious freedom, of course, is a fundamental human right and a key issue in countries that top our foreign policy agenda, from Egypt to China, Iraq to Sudan, Nigeria to Vietnam, Russia to Turkey. Promoting and protecting this right has never been more vital or challenging. By any measure, religious freedom matters, and yet, as you've noted, across the globe, it is routinely violated. I know a number of you mentioned the Pew study, which was quite alarming and disconcerting. Members of every religious community are being persecuted somewhere in the world. Hindus, Sikhs, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Evangelicals, Jews, Baha'is, Ahmadiyas, Sunnis, Sufis, Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, the Falun Gong, Jehovah's Witnesses. It's truly chilling to see the number of religious minorities that are persecuted. And in some countries, it's majority Muslim communities that are even persecuted by their own governments. And now this raises an obvious question. Why should we as the United States care about this? Well, first of all, of course, we should care because it's wrong to hunt down, imprison, torture, and kill people simply because they want to follow the dictates of their conscience. But we also should care because every available study finds that religious freedom is correlated with stability and security in this world. Nations that fail to protect religious freedom and other rights are breeding grounds for poverty, war, and violent extremist movements which give rise to terrorism. Of course, Mr. Payne, Nigeria being a very perfect example of this right now. In the struggle for religious freedom overseas, USCIRF remains the world's only independent government body fully dedicated to this cause. And through our work, we've spotlighted the world's worst religious freedom violators. We've helped to get religious prisoners released in places like Saudi Arabia and Turkmenistan. We helped lay the groundwork for the defeat this year at the UN Defamation of Religions Resolution, essentially a global blasphemy measure, by partnering with members of Congress, the State Department, and specific UN member states. We raised the need to identify Iranian officials and entities responsible for severe religious freedom violations and impose travel bans and asset freezes on such offenders. These sanctions are included in the comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, which requires the President to impose tough sanctions against Iranian human rights and religious freedom violators. As part of its continued concern about religious freedom in Sudan, USCIRF was the first entity to call for the Secretary of State's direct engagement in the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and was one of the first U.S. government entities to meet with Sudanese refugees who had fled aerial bombardments in the Nuba Mountains and were now at the Yida refugee camp in South Sudan. Our staff just came back from that area a couple of weeks ago, and the situation is really concerning and chilling in the border region, as you noted, Mr. Payne. USCIRF recently released a landmark study, which I have here, detailing how Pakistan's educational system, both its public schools and madrasas, serve as an incubator of intolerance and religious extremism, while also revealing some unexpected opportunities to pursue positive reforms. By any reasonable calculation, USCIRF is an effective and pivotal advocate for freedom of religion or belief, yet our commission, of course, cannot go it alone. Simply stated, we need both our legislative and executive branch partners to help us fulfill our mission. In September of this year, the full House voted overwhelmingly to reauthorize our commission. The Senate has yet to pass a measure reauthorizing USCIRF, and USCIRF is on the verge of expiring. This must not happen. It would signal to the world that the United States is retreating from the cause of religious freedom. So our hope is that the Senate will act, and hopefully can act this week. Clearly, we need Congress, and we also need the executive branch as full partners in the religious freedom battle. That includes the State Department, and let me commend the great work by Ambassador Johnson Cook and her team at the Office of International Religious Freedom in compiling the September 2011 IRF report. We applaud the concurrent release of the IRF report and the State Department's designating of CPC status for the world's worst religious freedom violators. While we are disappointed that our recommendations for CPC status for countries like Vietnam and Pakistan were not acted on, we welcome the Obama administration's keeping prior CPC nations on the list. Make no mistake, religious freedom matters. As Elie Wiesel once said, and I quote, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor. Silence encourages the tormentor. What all victims need is to know that they are not alone, that when their voices are stifled, we shall lend them ours, that while their freedom depends on ours, the quality of our freedom depends on theirs." Let us have a fully engaged U.S. government dedicated to that proposition. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Leo, thank you very much for your testimony. This report that your commission put out this year, if not the best, it certainly is among the best, but I would argue it is the best years to date. So thank you for a very comprehensive analysis of the problem with very concrete examples that hopefully Congress and the executive branch and all interested parties will take seriously and look to implement. But when it comes to legislation, obviously that's here and at the White House that we need to be taking special note. Let me, you were too kind, I think, in suggesting that the existing CPC countries were retained. Of course, there's always concerns that political issues will intervene and some of those countries might drop off. I think the shock value for China, for example, having been on it now virtually every year, they have realized that there is next to no sanction that follows. Therefore, my hope would be that if the administration is serious, because just this morning I held my 33rd hearing on human rights abuses in China as chairman of the China Executive Commission, things are getting far worse in China towards everyone who cares about human rights, workers' rights, but especially towards those who manifest a belief in God, or in the case of the Falun Gong, a spiritual exercise. The crackdown is pervasive and severe. It's not just ongoing, it is getting worse. And I would hope, as you had said and has said before, that we don't just talk about double-hatting sanctions that are pre-existing, that there be some breakout, and that these countries like China and Sudan and certainly Saudi Arabia, which has gotten away virtually scot-free as well when it comes to penalty, are held to account. But the countries you did mention, Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Vietnam, it is baffling as to why. I mean, when we did this legislation, and all the hearings were held right in this room by yours truly on Frank Wolf's bill, and he testified, he was obviously the author of the legislation. But we never meant that the designation should in any way be nothing but speaking truth to power. And yet these countries which you so bravely, I think, put forward that should be on the list have been elusive in terms of the State Department putting those countries on the list. It is baffling, and I do hope we can get some answers from the administration as to why. Because what they do in terms of penalty and the next step, you know, may go through an additional process of what is the most efficacious way of advancing the ball, but just tell the truth. If they're a country of particular concern, put them on. Maybe you might want to speak to some of those countries. Egypt, we just had a hearing, as you know, on the forced abduction of Coptic Christian girls. Michelle Clark testified, a great leader at the OSCE for years on human trafficking, and she has done great reporting, working with Christian Solidarity International on these young teenagers who are first abducted and then forced into Islamic marriages when they turn 18, abused along the way, and yet our administration says these are just allegations. It's time, she said, we are beyond the allegation stage. It is real and it's pervasive. Egypt, you may want to speak to some of the issues that you believe ought to have been placed on CPC status.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first, as an institutional matter, there's a real problem with passing over certain countries for CPC status, just as there is a real problem with not imposing sanctions or always double-hatting sanctions. Eritrea is, I think, the only country that has direct sanctions under IRFA on it. The problem with not designated countries, it clearly should be, and the problem with not having a sanctions regime that really works, is it sends a terrible message to, one, some of the countries that are on the list, because they believe being placed on the list really doesn't have any impact. And secondly, it sends a very strong message to other countries that we're not serious about bolstering preservation of freedom of religion around the world, so why should they do anything to improve conditions there back at home? And so it's very, very important, and I think the creators of the IRF Act understood this, that the CPC designation process itself be very rigorous, and that similar countries be treated alike, and that they be placed on the list, and that when you're placed on the list, there is some force that comes to bear on that country to ensure compliance with international human rights standards. Now, with regard to the particular countries you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that are not on the list, for example, Pakistan and Egypt, conditions in Pakistan, as you well know, are horrific. In addition to various forms of state-sponsored repression, one of the most serious problems in Pakistan is impunity. Private sectarian violence that is unchecked by the government. And that is caused by a number of factors. For one thing, it's caused by a blasphemy law, which incentivizes people to take matters into their own hands and to seek to punish individuals who they believe are not treating religion properly. Secondly, as we noted in the report we just issued on Pakistan's educational system, the madrasas and public schools in Pakistan are teaching a level of intolerance that is just unacceptable. And that level of intolerance affects not only minority Muslim communities and Christians, but also Hindus in Pakistan, and that is a very, very serious problem. Egypt, Egypt, you see a lot of the same problems, Mr. Chairman. You see, again, impunity, a situation where violence perpetrated against the Coptic Christian communities remains unchecked. This was a problem during the Mubarak administration, but it is a problem now just as well, and there doesn't seem to be any end of it in sight. We've also seen very significant repression by the state of various religious minorities, including the Baha'i community.
Without objection, I would like to add the summary, multi-page summary of Connecting the Dots, Education and Religious Discrimination in Pakistan, the excellent study. I know it's much longer, but this is the shorter version, at which your office has looked so carefully into the educational system. If you want to just further elaborate on that briefly, because this is a very, very troubling report.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We commissioned a study to look at a number of public schools as well as madrasas around Pakistan. And the idea behind the study was, one, to see what kinds of things are being taught to these children regarding the various faiths in Pakistan. And then secondly, to see what links existed between the education they received and the kinds of intolerance and extremism we see in Pakistani society right now. And much to our dismay, what we found was that there are elements of nationalism and prejudice that cause teachers to teach students in these schools that those who are religious minorities are not full citizens in Pakistan. All of the normal prejudices about Jews and Christians and Hindus are perpetrated through the curriculum. And what we found through the focus groups and other studies that took place here over the course of a year is that this discrimination and these pejorative references end up creating a young citizenry in Pakistan which is very intolerant of religious minorities, doesn't understand what they believe in, view them as a threat to Pakistan's culture, and that's a very, very serious problem. And we believe, and I think the study bears this out, that that kind of extremist, intolerant education creates great instability in the country. It fuels extremism. It causes Pakistan to be a breeding ground for violent extremist ideology that's exported throughout North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. Payne, if you go to northern Nigeria, you will find pamphlets and leaflets that were sent over from Pakistan that are quite extremist in their orientation. So we think the educational system in Pakistan needs great improvement. Fortunately, the madrasas in Pakistan, the private schools, many of them actually want to reform the curriculum. But the stumbling block is that that would require a change in the rules or laws by the Interior Ministry of Pakistan. And until the Interior Ministry responds and starts to change the rules of the game, those private madrasas can't change their curricula. And so one of our objectives is to try to have the United States to put as much pressure as possible on the Pakistani government to change those rules so that those madrasas can reform their curricula, which we believe in turn would put competitive pressure on the public schools to do the same.
Very briefly on Vietnam, because then I'll yield to my colleagues for any questions. And I'm going to submit several questions because time does not permit asking all of them. But would you briefly touch on what was clearly an about-face, what looked like some progress being made in the lead-up to the trade agreement between the U.S. and Vietnam and most favored nation status being granted? Almost to the day, there was a U-turn, and people espousing human rights in general and religious freedom in particular have been rounded up and have been harassed, clearly indicating that CPC status ought to be imposed upon Vietnam. And secondly, in Sudan, with Bashir and Khartoum contemplating a new constitution that would be very exclusionary towards people of other faiths and even some Muslims. Many people are leaving, some going to South Sudan. Could you just perhaps touch on that very briefly?
Well, as you point out, Mr. Chairman, the situation in Vietnam took an about-face after WTO accession. The Vietnamese wanted WTO accession. Once they got it, they walked away from the table on religious freedom. It's just that simple. There was a carrot and a stick around prior to WTO accession. When that went away, there wasn't much left. And this is one of those instances where we believe that CPC status would really be a game changer, because we know that that kind of pressure has worked with the Vietnamese in the past. And we're at a stage in our relations with Vietnam where there are bilateral negotiations on a lot of fronts involving trade and the economy and culture, and to have that leverage again would be extraordinarily valuable. You're quite right. The situation in Vietnam is getting worse, not better. You have public order regulations and rules that are being used in a very arbitrary and abusive way to put away and detain people of faith, oftentimes Catholic priests. You have communities in Vietnam that have had their cemeteries and religious grounds bulldozed so that the state can erect resorts. This is a very, very serious problem. With regard to Sudan, where to begin? All of us saw July 9th come and go, and there was a lot of fanfare in the press about Sudan's independence. Where is the press now? Mass graves of more than 5,000 Christians and other southern Sudanese, aerial bombardments at night of refugee camps. Every single church and clergyman in South Kordofan is gone. They've left. There's not a single church in the entire state. When you combine all of that which is happening on the border region with the so-called constitutional reform, which is going to be taking place in North Sudan, where President Bashir has said he wants to create an Islamist state, you have an extremely unstable set of regimes, and you have a set of regimes where human rights abuses will continue to be perpetrated in a way that it should be of enormous concern and alarm to the United States. But it's not making the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post. It's not capturing the attention of most world leaders. It's a very, very serious situation. We met just a couple of weeks ago with the Deputy National Security Advisor to the German Chancellor, and he wasn't aware of the mass graves in the border region of South Sudan. Wasn't aware of the aerial bombardments, the refugee camp. It's terrible, absolutely terrible, and we must stand up and do something. And I think the first step that we should take right now is tell the North Sudanese that if they want debt relief, which is something they're trotting the globe trying to get right now, it should be conditioned on them creating a pathway for humanitarian assistance to the refugees in the border region and the cessation of aerial bombardments. And if they are not willing to undertake those two humanitarian gestures, which will not only protect people of faith, but all peoples, then we should not bargain with Khartoum.
Thank you. Mr. Payne.
Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Leal, for your continued strong positions on this issue. I, too, am very disturbed at what is occurring in Sudan. We, as you indicated, thought July 9th would be a new time, a new day. The government of Sudan has actually even had some bombings across the border into South Sudan recently. It's been reported, and the situation in South Kordofan is just untenable. As you know, there was supposed to be an agreement since South Kordofan was incorporated into Sudan. Although South Kordofan, as you know, fought with the South Sudanese and were part of the SPLM and SPLA. And so the fact that they've been incorporated in another country really makes them captives in Sudan, where they really should be a part of South Sudan. And so I, too, agree there's been in the past several months, it seems a feeling on the part of some in the administration that because Bashir went along with June 9th, that there should be some carrots that should be given. But I agree, I certainly concur with you that I think that there are too many unresolved issues. There's no question about Darfur. Darfur is even not discussed very much. People living out in desert conditions in Chad and in refugee camps going to be going on 8 years. With no plans for Sudan to talk about a right to return for people in Darfur. They're just there. As a matter of fact, as you may recall, they even had the humanitarian food delivery interrupted about a year or so ago, where they were excluding human rights organizations attempting and decided which NGOs would have the right to give relief to the Darfurians. And so we have a very serious situation there. In your opinion, since the separation, and I know it's only been a short time, do you think that in the North things have, in general, have worsened, or is there more unity in Sudan, Khartoum government?
Thank you, Mr. Payne, and again, thank you very much for your leadership on these issues as part of the caucus.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, things have deteriorated in the northern part, in North Sudan. on a couple of fronts. First of all, President Bashir has tried to snuff out all political opposition. And in the absence of that sort of diverse political opposition, there is not going to be a full-throttle debate about what kind of constitutional government Sudan should have and whether freedom of religion will be an integral part of it. Because as you know, some of that political opposition is grounded in other non-conforming views of Islam. And so in the absence of that, you won't have the kind of diversity of opinion that would lead to a constitution that had greater protections for religious minorities. Secondly, there still are, in addition to sort of non-conforming Muslims, there still are some Christians who live in the north, and they're very, very concerned for their well-being because the kind of Islamist state that President Bashir has promised to create would be wholly consistent with their long-term well-being and survival in North Sudan. It's part of the reason why so many of them have already fled to South Sudan. The problem, of course, is that things are not a whole lot better there for them because South Sudan doesn't have the capacity to care for these people. Yeah. So they're in a no-win situation. And then finally, because the North never really created a media law that allows for a vibrant press, there's very little sunlight cast on what's going on there. And so much of the world, the EU and other parts of the world, really don't fully comprehend the extent of the repression.
Thank you very much. Getting to the State Department, I understand that the State Department has labeled 8 countries of particular concern. In the report produced by USEF, you identified an additional 6. Is there any way you could determine what factors factor into the way that CPC looks at it as opposed to the State Department?
Well, some of it, Mr. Payne, is institutional. I mean, USER's mandate is to look solely at religious freedom violations. So when we look at a country, that's our single-minded focus by the terms of our statute. Obviously, the State Department does look at a broad range of factors when it decides how to deal with a country. So even though, oftentimes our findings in the State Department's on a country might be very similar in terms of religious freedom violations, they may make the determination that naming them a country of particular concern or imposing certain sanctions is not going to have the intended effect of improving conditions. Now, we often disagree with that. So in the case of Pakistan, I suspect what the State Department would tell you is naming Pakistan as CPC will hurt rather than help. That will be their argument. We respectfully disagree. We believe that there's not going to ever be a perfect time to name Pakistan as a CPC, but that in fact we're at a point in Pakistan's cultural life where there are a sufficient number of imams and madrasas who believe in reform, that naming Pakistan as a CPC and then being very strategic in terms of the way we dialogue about various kinds of reforms, we could actually help to embolden communities in Pakistan who could sort of start to move the ball in a positive direction. Similarly, what you'd be told about a country like Vietnam is that there's been some progress made and we're having human rights dialogues with them. Again, we understand that argument, but we respectfully disagree. Our view of the history is that Vietnam has only responded and responded favorably when they've had a lot of pressure come to bear on them as a country. So to some extent it's institutional. We look at one issue, they look at a basket. To some extent it's situational. We sometimes gauge the cultural factors differently than the State Department does.
Thank you very much. Since we are going to have a vote soon, I agree that they tend to, even in dealing with Bashir, when I would be pushing for very hard sanctions, they would say, well, there are some other leaders in Sudan that could be worse, and so we have to be careful so it doesn't get worse. But I agree, you know, I've never heard anyone being able to predict or to predict the unknown. I mean, you can't validate the unknown. You don't know what the next leader would be. So I have the same kind of problems that with some of their findings that you probably have in your capacity. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I had a couple of issues I wanted to cover with you, Mr. Leo. Again, thank you for being here. I wanted to really talk about the importance of interfaith dialogue. In Nigeria, there's a model program there, the Mediation Center. We've heard good reports about. I wanted to ask how important this interfaith dialogue is in promoting religious freedom, number one. What is USERF doing to promote this, and is there anything more that can be done?
Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. Interfaith dialogue is obviously very important. And you mentioned Nigeria, where there has been an infrastructure for interfaith dialogue between the Muslim communities and the Christian communities there, oftentimes led by the Sultan of Sokoto and Archbishop Onaikan of the Catholic Church and the Sultan of northern Nigeria, and a leading member of the Muslim community there. But you know, in recent months and in the past year, we noticed in our trips to Nigeria, we've been there about 4 times in the past 2 years, that things are really starting to break down, and the interfaith dialogue isn't working as well as it used to. And I think the reason that it is the case is because you need to buttress interfaith dialogue with a strong set of enforcement mechanisms when extremists break the law. So in Nigeria, the problem, and Mr. Payne, you mentioned Boko Haram, the problem in Nigeria right now is that there are a bunch of extremists, Boko Haram among them, that are perpetrating an enormous amount of violence in the Middle Belt region of Nigeria. And the Nigerian government is doing very little, if anything, to investigate, prosecute, and bring to justice the people who perpetrate that violence. Well, what does that do? Well, what it does is it breaks up the discussion at that interfaith table, because suddenly the people who have friends and relatives who have been killed and no justice has been done to sort of, you know, punish the perpetrators of that violence, they don't want to talk anymore. They don't want to find common ground. They want vindication that what was done to their community was wrong. And so what I think, in terms of what more can be done to bolster interfaith dialogue, first of all, you have to find the kinds of talented leaders that, you know, Nigeria has, like the Sultan and the Archbishop. But then also, the government has to be committed to enforcing the law when violence takes place, or no one will sit down and dialogue. And we have seen that in country after country after country, although Nigeria in recent years has been the most recent example. The U.S. has dedicated, I think, a significant amount of aid in various countries toward this dialogue. I think that's a good thing, Nigeria being one of them. But I think we need to probably combine that kind of aid with aid to train prosecutors and law enforcement officials about how to deal with the perpetration of religiously related violence in a way that's consistent with human rights.
And if we have time, Mr. Chairman, I'll try to get one more in before we have to go vote. I wanted to ask about the role the internet and social media are playing, either in a harmful way or a positive way within the context of religious freedom. Certainly we've seen it have a dramatic impact across the Middle East and North Africa during this Arab Spring. But in particular, how are those tools being used in positive or negative ways to promote international religious freedom?
There's no question that the internet and social media has been very empowering for human rights defenders and religious minorities around the world. You've seen some of it in the Middle East, you see some of it in China and in Vietnam, and that's very, very important. So internet freedom is a very important policy issue for the United States in this regard, because it really does empower and bolster those human rights defenders and those people who want to defend religious minorities. But at the same time, Mr. Carnahan, the internet and social media can be a tool used for violence and for evil. And so what we've seen in northern and sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is that the internet has been a tool for the Taliban and other extremist groups to ship their ideology to groups and individuals in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Boko Haram, for example, gets a lot of its material off the internet. When we met in Nigeria with the head of the security services, they said that the internet is probably the #1 thing that sort of perpetuated the sort of violent extremism among members of Boko Haram. And that's the case in other countries too. We see that in Indonesia, where there are extremist elements that get a lot of extremist ideology through the internet from Pakistan and from Saudi Arabia. So it's a wonderful tool and resource for human rights defenders, but it can also be used for evil purposes, and so we need to probably complement our internet freedom efforts with a campaign against the exportation of extremist ideology around the world.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. Let me ask 3 final questions, and I will keep the record open even if we all have to leave here, and I would hope, Mr. Leo, you would answer the questions in full. With regards to India, Bishop Ramirez has made a very interesting point in his testimony that the State Department doesn't designate India as a CPC country, has no watch list. India is one of the few countries where Yusuf has not been able to arrange even a delegation visit, despite several attempts to obtain visas. The failure seems particularly unusual in light of the fact that the U.S. entered into a strategic dialogue with India in 2009, and there have been several high-level visits exchanged. Religious freedom does not appear to have been a topic of discussion in this strategic dialogue. Secondly, on Iraq, as the bishop points out again, Bishop Ramirez, this is my words, we kind of own Iraq in the sense that we, by being involved in the war, which was opposed by the church, there is a responsibility now, a heightened responsibility on the U.S. to ensure that the minority religions that are millennium old, go back to the founding of the church, are facing extreme pressures, discrimination, and murder. If you want to speak on Iraq, I would appreciate that. And finally, the bishop makes another very important comment, many important comments, that there is too little public evidence, he writes, that protection of religious freedom is factored into major bilateral foreign policy decisions on a day-to-day basis. The strategic dialogues with several key countries seldom even mention religious freedom in public records of discussions. The issue may have been raised in private, but there needs to be a more overt recognition of the importance that the U.S. places on protection of religious freedom. Otherwise, it may appear that our nation is going through the motions of satisfying a congressional mandate, but not following up by making religious freedom an integral part of the foreign policy decision-making process. As you know, that's why we passed this law in the first place, because religious freedom was always relegated to the back of the talking points, if that. And if you could speak to that issue, if you would, because, you know, how many years after, since 1998, since enactment of this law, and we're still having this discussion where this has not been mainstreamed and made an integral part of our foreign policy?
Well, His Excellency Bishop Ramirez is, as he always was as a commissioner of USERF, spot on. These religious freedom issues are not adequately factored into our bilateral discussions, and we are constantly pressing for those issues to sort of come to the surface and be higher priorities. That's especially been the case recently with a number of Southeast Asian countries where, in the case of China and Vietnam, for example, we're just not seeing freedom of religion reach that level. My hope is that over time, the IRF office and the IRF ambassador can inflict more pressure within the State Department system to sort of try to make those issues a higher priority. We have hopes that Vice President Biden, in his upcoming visit to Turkey, I think he's leaving very soon, will engage the Turks on the issue of freedom of religion, in particularly the reopening of the Halki Seminary. So I think having the Vice President engage in that way would send a very, very strong signal to the bureaus in the State Department that religious freedom needs to be critical on a bilateral basis. You mentioned India and Iraq. Look, very different countries in a lot of ways, but the one common element there is impunity. And what you see in India and in Iraq is just a situation where there needs to be, as much as possible, an effort to prosecute religiously related violence. Obviously, the situation is very different in India, where there have been investigations and prosecutions. The question is the extent and speed, and that's something we're looking into and trying to engage with the Indian government on. The situation in Iraq is much worse. I mean, there's almost a total breakdown in prosecution and of religiously related violence, and it's causing the extinction of the Christian community in that country.
If I may, another question on, if we get back to Pakistan for a moment, and I catch my breath. The madrasas. I understand there's funding from Saudi Arabia. Do you feel that has an impact? And does our own foreign aid, which is probably not used as leverage, can that counter it? Are we doing what we can and should?
First of all, there's no question that the Saudis are responsible for the exportation of an enormous amount of extremist ideology. Their textbooks and educational materials have not been reformed as they should be. They speak of spilling the blood of the infidel, that is Christians and Jews. There are a lot of other very concerning passages throughout their materials. When we visited Saudi Arabia recently and met with the Minister of Religious Affairs, we were not satisfied with the responses he or the Minister of Education gave in terms of the extent to which they're trying to clean up their educational and other materials. But the bottom line is, because Saudi Arabia is, if you will, the Vatican of Islam, their educational materials serve as the basis for a lot of education elsewhere in the world. And so they are exporting a brand of extremism often, which is very toxic. And we have seen that in Pakistan, Mr. Turner, with a number of the madrasas, where there are a lot of pejorative commentaries about Hindus and about Christians and about Jews, and that is helping to perpetuate some very negative stereotypes amongst the young people in Pakistan, which breeds violence. Pakistan is a little bit more complicated than that, though, in the sense that there are some madrasas in Pakistan, we were talking about this earlier, that do want to reform their curricula. This is, I think, due in part to the fabulous work that was done by the late Shahbaz Bhatti, the Minister of Minority Affairs, who was violently assassinated on his way to his first cabinet meeting. He brought together quite a number of imams in and around Islamabad and Pakistan who wanted to see reform. They control some of those madrasas and others, and some of those madrasas do want to reform their curricula, but that's going to require new rules and laws that could be handed down by the Interior Ministry in Pakistan, and they haven't done that yet. And until they do that, those who do want to reform their curricula within the madrasas won't be able to. Now, our hope is that if we can get the Pakistani government to change those rules so that some of these madrasas can actually change their curricula, that will begin to put valuable competitive pressure on other madrasas and, by extension, public schools in Pakistan, so that some of them will begin to think about whether they should be changing their curricula as well. So there are signs of hope here. There are some young people and there are some teachers who want to reform education in Pakistan, who are more broad-minded about the role that minorities play in their country. But a lot of work has to be done, and that's going to require both the Pakistani government to change some of its rules, and frankly, on a global scale, the Saudis to begin to take more seriously their obligation to clean up their own educational materials, which do get pushed around all over the world, including here in the United States at the Islamic Saudi Academy just across the river in Fairfax.
And as far as United States leverage is concerned, are we exercising that properly, or are we exercising it at all with both the Saudis and Pakistan?
The Commission's position is that we are not exercising our leverage sufficiently. In the case of Saudi Arabia, though we've named Saudi Arabia as a country of particular concern for years, we have had an indefinite presidential waiver on any sanctions. The Commission's position is that basically there should be a time period within which that presidential waiver remains, but that if certain reforms are not achieved within that time period, the waiver ceases to exist and sanctions begin to come down hard on the Saudi government. And where they really need reforms are in terms of their educational materials, in terms of the religious police, and a couple of other things under Saudi law. With regard to Pakistan, I'd say the same thing. You know, there's never going to be, as we said before, never going to be a good time to name Pakistan or any other country as a CPC. But the bottom line is that in our view, now is the time to name them as a CPC. Conditions are worsening. The blasphemy law is being applied in terrible ways. There are over 100 individuals, and we can supply you with the chart. There are over 100 individuals, Christians, non-conforming Muslims, Hindus, who are imprisoned under their blasphemy law. And that, by the way, breeds enormous violence and hostility in the country. And the United States is doing nothing to really sort of try to put pressure on the Pakistanis to change that atmosphere.
Thank you, Mr. Leo. A final question. You noted in your testimony that a political issue in the Senate unrelated to the Commission is holding up the Commission's reauthorization, which technically expired in September. Although the continuing resolution is providing temporary funding for the Commission, and we hope another CR is passed tomorrow, what will it take, and that will take the Commission at least through December. The failure of the Senate to pass USCIRF's reauthorization is extremely problematic. Could you tell us how it is affecting your operation?
Well, it's very hard for the Commission to do any long-range planning when we are not sure of our continued existence, and when we live from CR to CR in a way that's different from most other federal agencies, because we're not an executive branch agency that has the benefit of longevity. So basically, we've had a very hard time mapping out a longer range agenda. There have been a number of missed opportunities in terms of putting pressure on various countries. But you know, our hope is that the Senate will act on a piece of freestanding legislation that is at the Senate desk right now. We're hoping it gets done this week, and then that legislation gets sent here to the House, and we can resolve this issue, you know, before long. Should have happened over a month ago, but it didn't.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Leo. And at this point, we'd like to call the second panel. And again, we thank you. We have Bishop Ricardo Ramirez. We have Mr. Bishop Ricardo Ramirez is a Catholic bishop of the Diocese of Las Cruces, New Mexico. He served as a commissioner in the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2003 to 2006. Bishop Ramirez was ordained to the episcopacy in 1981 and has lived in Canada, Mexico, and the Philippines. He is the member of the International Justice and Peace Commission within the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Mr. Benedict Rogers of the Christian Solidarity Worldwide. Mr. Rogers is East Asia team leader for Christian Solidarity Worldwide. Mr. Rogers specializes in human rights in Burma, Indonesia, and North Korea, and oversees CSW's work in China, Vietnam, and Laos. He has traveled extensively in the region and regularly publishes articles and books about human rights in these countries. Mr. Rogers serves as the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission in the UK. In 2005, he served as special advisor to the special representative of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Freedom of Religion panel. We have Reverend Majid El Sharif. How's that? Bad? Very bad. Okay. Would you please say it for me? That Majid El Shafi.
Reverend Majid El Shafi, you did a great job. Thank you.
A little better then. All right. Well, thank you. From One World International, Reverend El Shafi is the president and founder of the One Free World International, a human rights NGO dedicated to securing the rights of religious minorities around the world. The Reverend is both an ordained minister and an Egyptian lawyer by training. After converting from Islam to Christianity, Reverend El Shafi was arrested by the Mubarak regime in 1998, tortured and sentenced to death. He escaped, fled to Israel, and finally settled in Canada in 2002. He has been interviewed by numerous media outlets and has advised the Canadian government on religious freedom issues. Thank you. And finally, we have Mr. R. Drew Smith, Center for Church and Black Experience of the Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Dr. Smith is the director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. He is also scholar in residence at the Leadership Center at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Smith has taught at several major institutions of higher education and has traveled widely in Latin America and Africa. He served as a Fulbright professor in South Africa in 2005 and as a Fulbright senior specialist in Cameroon, and has lectured in Brazil, Ghana, Lesotho, and Israel. He has published widely on religious and public life, including numerous articles and book chapters. Thank you very much. Bishop Ramirez, would you please open and proceed?
Religious freedom. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate your leadership on this issue. I am, as you said, Ricardo Ramirez, the Bishop of Las Cruces. I currently serve on the Committee of International Justice and Peace of our Bishops' Conference. I also had the honor and pride of serving on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2003 to 2007. I will summarize our testimony and ask that the full written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection, yours and all those who would like to submit their testimonies will be made a part of the record, as well as any extraneous materials you'd like to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the Catholic teaching, religious freedom, rooted in the dignity of the human person, is a cornerstone of the structure of human rights and is closely tied to freedoms of speech, association, and assembly. Religious freedom is not solely freedom from coercion in matters of personal faith. It is also freedom to practice the faith individually and communally, in private and public. Freedom of religion extends beyond freedom of worship. It includes the freedom of the church and religious organizations to provide education, health, and other social services, as well as to allow religiously motivated individuals and communities to participate in public policy debates and thus contribute to the common good. Unfortunately, as has been mentioned before today, religious freedom is under attack in many countries around the world. In China, the police crack down on the faithful who simply want a place to worship. In Egypt, extremists burn churches, and Christians are persecuted in Eritrea, Baha'is in Iran, Ahmadis in Indonesia, and Christian and Muslims in Uzbekistan. The New Year's Day bombing of a Coptic church in Egypt, the Christmas Eve bombings of churches in Nigeria, and the October 2010 attack on the Syrian Catholic Church in Baghdad are grim reminders of what is at stake. While the annual State Department's International Religious Freedom Report for 2010 is commendable and fairly thorough, let me offer brief comments on a few countries. Our staff met on several occasions with Shahbaz Bhatti, the Pakistani Minister for Minority Affairs, who was assassinated in March 2011. This followed the January 2011 assassination of Punjab Governor Salman Taseer, a Muslim. Both were targeted because of their support for changes in blasphemy laws that are often used to justify acts against religious minorities. Our Bishops' Conference asked the Department of State to consider whether these assassinations and other issues warrant designating Pakistan as a country of particular concern next year. The State Department report documents a number of abuses of religious freedom in India. However, there are undoubtedly other instances not documented. Our staff visited India in March 2010 to look into the 2008 attacks of Christians in the state of Orissa. While the report does refer to the incident, there is no mention, as you said, Mr. Chairman, of the ongoing suffering experienced by Christian villagers whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed. Many remain displaced, fearful of returning to their homes. The State Department report on forced conversions makes scant mention of Christians being forced to convert to Hinduism in order to return to their villages. The U.S. entered into a strategic dialogue with India in 2009, but religious freedom does not appear to have been a topic for discussion. This October, two of our bishops made a pastoral visit to Baghdad. The ancient Christian communities in Iraq have been decimated. The State Department report does not highlight the fact that high levels of violence have led to a disproportionate number of Christians, many professionals fleeing abroad as refugees or being displaced internally. As the U.S. withdraws, we must work with Iraqis to improve the rule of law, security, and economic opportunity. We must also help refugees and internally displaced persons. This will require continued U.S. international assistance. We have several recommendations. First, the Congress and the administration need to place a higher priority on religious freedom. There is too little public evidence that protection of religious freedom is factored into major bilateral foreign policy decisions. Second, State Department needs to give greater consideration to designating countries of particular concern. The Commission on International Religious Freedoms list is longer, adding other countries such as Iraq, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Turkmenistan. USERF also maintains a watch list of countries where trends indicate the predisposition towards severe violations of religious freedom. Countries on the USERF's watch list change from year to year. We're concerned that the State Department list may not adequately reflect changing conditions. Third, the President and the Secretary of State should consider more closely actions that might be applied to those states where particularly severe violations of religious freedom occur. Fourth and finally, the Senate should move to reauthorize the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, whose mandate expires tomorrow. It would be tragic if this vital institution were to cease its promotion of religious freedom around the world. Let me close by commending the distinguished members of this subcommittee for holding this hearing and for raising the profile of religious freedom in our nation's conscience and in its foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bishop Ramirez, for your testimony and for your leadership and that of the Catholic Bishops' Conference. I'd like to now ask Mr. Rogers if you could present your testimony.
Chairman Smith, distinguished members of the committee, first of all, may I thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to submit evidence to this very important and timely hearing, and thank you also for your leadership and many years of dedicated hard work on behalf of those who are persecuted for their faith. With permission, I will focus on the countries for which I'm responsible, namely Burma, China, Indonesia, North Korea, and Vietnam, and I will attempt to do so in just as many minutes. Let me start first with Burma. Many Buddhist monks, including U Gambira, a very prominent monk, remain in prison. The plight of the Muslim Rohingya people remains unchanged. In predominantly Christian Kachin state, which I have visited several times, the regime has launched a new military offensive, resulting in very grave human rights violations, including attacks on churches and new restrictions on religious freedom. There is some talk of change in Burma. However, as long as the regime holds Buddhist monks and other prisoners of conscience in jail, attacks civilians in the ethnic states, and violates religious freedom, the United States should maintain pressure on the regime and redesignate Burma a CPC. Briefly, Indonesia. In July, the European Parliament passed a resolution expressing grave concern at the incidents of violence against religious minorities. A similar resolution from this Congress would be very welcome. In May, 4 Ahmadi Muslims, traumatized, terrorized, and stigmatized, sat in a Jakarta apartment and described to me how they were almost killed by an extremist mob. One man had been stripped naked, beaten to a pulp, a machete held at his throat. Another fled into a fast-flowing river, pursued by attackers throwing rocks and shouting, "Kill, kill, kill." Churches are also coming under increasing pressure in Indonesia. This year alone, so far, at least 30 churches have been attacked. There are serious concerns over the rule of law in Indonesia, and I've detailed these concerns in my written submission. But I'd like to draw your particular attention to the case of the GKI Yasmin Church in Bogor, which I visited just a few weeks ago. Increasing intolerance towards religious minorities poses significant challenges to Indonesia's tradition of religious freedom. The failure of the government to protect minorities and uphold the rule of law has encouraged extremists. I hope that when President Obama visits Indonesia in the next few days, he will appeal to the President of Indonesia to uphold religious freedom and the rule of law. I turn now to North Korea. I visited North Korea in October last year with 2 British parliamentarians, Lord Alton and Baroness Cox. North Korea is clearly one of the worst violators of human rights, including religious freedom, in the world. An estimated 200,000 people, some of them Christians, are trapped in a brutal system of political prison camps. Just a few days ago, I received from a trusted source a story of a young female North Korean teenager who had engaged in evangelism, which was eventually discovered by the regime. She was executed. Where else in the world are teenagers, minors, who share their faith, executed for doing so? Alarmingly, the reach of the North Korean regime's brutality extends even beyond its borders, involving assassinations or attempted assassinations of South Korean Christian missionaries working with North Korean refugees. Earlier this year, CSW, along with 40 other organizations, launched an international coalition to stop crimes against humanity in North Korea. And we believe that these violations, including violations of religious freedom, do amount to crimes against humanity, that it is time that impunity in North Korea be ended, crimes investigated, and Kim Jong-il's regime brought to account. As you said, Mr. Chairman, religious freedom in China has severely deteriorated. A widely publicized case is that of the Shawang Church in Beijing, which has faced continual pressure to stop meeting. They've been denied access to their building and have been meeting outdoors, facing arrest and detention. Pastor Shi En-hao was arrested in May this year and sentenced to 2 years re-education through labor. Alumijiang Yamiti, a Christian Uyghur from Xinjiang, was sentenced in 2009 to 15 years in prison, the harshest sentence in a decade for a Christian. Finding a lawyer to represent such cases is increasingly difficult. Lawyers increasingly face intense pressure from the authorities. One lawyer, Dr. Fan Yafeng, has been under house arrest since December 2010. Another lawyer, Gao Zhisheng, disappeared and has not been heard of since April last year. China is now considering amending the criminal procedure law to effectively legalize forced disappearance. Currently, there is no basis for house arrest under Chinese law, but these amendments would legalize this and allow police to hold individuals in secret locations without informing their families. China should certainly remain a CPC. Following the removal of Vietnam from the CPC list in 2006, the religious freedom situation has indeed deteriorated, as other speakers have said. Several Christians remain in jail. These include the Catholic priest, Father Lee, and 2 Protestant lawyers. Father Lee remains in extremely poor health and has been returned to prison after medical parole. A US diplomat who tried to visit him earlier this year was physically harassed. Some of the most severe violations affect ethnic minorities. In September this year, 11 Protestant families in Dien Bien province were forced to renounce their faith. A major impediment to religious freedom in Vietnam is the registration system. Vietnam should be urged to redraft legislation to update Decree 22 to ensure the recognition of denominations and congregations continues. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, of these 5 countries, 3 are listed as countries of particular concern. One is a former country of particular concern that, as others have said, ought not to have been removed from that list and ought to be returned. And one is the world's largest Muslim majority country, the 3rd largest democracy, with, until recently, a great tradition of pluralism and a successful transition to democracy, which nevertheless shows worrying signs of failing to face challenges to religious freedom and the rule of law. There is therefore much work for all of us who are concerned about freedom of religion or belief in the East Asia region still to do. I want to express my appreciation to the US Commission for its work, and I hope very much it is able to continue its work, and I welcome and appreciate this committee's efforts as well. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers, thank you so very much. Matter of fact, on your last point, a mere matter of lifting a hold that Senator Durbin and apparently one other senator has on the IRFA bill, on the reauthorization of the commission, I should say, would bring it to the floor and it would pass, I believe, unanimously in the Senate. So there's only one obstruction, and the hope is that that obstruction, which is totally unrelated, we are told, to religious freedom, be lifted. You know, the Senate, as you know, has arcane rules that allows one member to throw a monkey wrench into the process, which is archaic, and most outsiders can't believe the U.S. Senate operates under those rules. But Senator Durbin has a hold on that bill. We hope that he lifts it. It would be totally unjust if he allows this commission to expire. I'd like to now have Reverend El Shafi, if you could proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and I would like to thank as well Rank Member Donald Payne, and I would like to thank Mr. Trainer and the rest of the members and the staffers. Thank you so much for your hard work. Mr. Chair, I will ask my full written statement to be included in the record, please, if that's possible. Thank you. One Free World International is a human rights organization based in Toronto, Canada. We have 28 branches around the world. Most of our branches operate as intelligent branches, which mean that we collect information about the persecution that's happening to the minorities. We dealt with many minorities. We helped many minorities, Christians, Falun Gongs, Uyghurs, Baha'i, Ahmadi, and many more. And as well, we stood against the rising of the anti-Semitism in many countries. After fact-finding missions that I took personally we confronted many governments, and usually in our delegation to meet with many governments, such as the government of Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan, we was accompanied by Canadian member of parliament and a Canadian senators. Today I will be speaking specifically about two countries, which is Egypt and Iraq, and I will be just briefly touching about the situation in Pakistan and Afghanistan. After what's so called Arab Spring, and I have no idea who called it Arab Spring, today the world is waking up to find it is not Arab Spring, is a cold, deadly winter on the minorities in the Middle East. If we talk about Egypt, since the starting of the revolution in January 25 until now, there is 12 attacks on the Christian Coptic minorities in Egypt. This 12 attacks is the major attacks. According to our resources on the ground, is more than 36 attacks, but the ones that we are aware of is the major attacks. Now, if I spoke specifically about one specific attacks was in October 9, the massacre of Maspero. Now, if we track a little bit, before October 9, in September 30, there is over 3,000 Muslim extremist mob that they attacked a church in Aswan, and the Mary Girgis Church in Aswan. After these attacks in October 9, the Christian Egyptian community went in a demonstration, peaceful demonstration, I repeat, peaceful demonstration in Maspero in Cairo. The military responded back, the Egyptian military responding back by firing a live ammunition on the demonstrators, armed cars and the tanks run over the people. Basically, over 26 people was killed, 300 was wounded. Not only that, that basically the Muslim hospitals in Cairo refused to receive the 300 wounded. Only one hospital accepted to receive them was the Coptic hospital in Cairo. After that, the Egyptian police arrested some of the wounded from this hospital, and until now they are prisoners in the Egyptian prison. All what we're seeing right now, according to our resources, this is just some of the pictures that we basically, from the demonstration. Mr. Chair, after that, in October 16, 5 days, a young man by the name Ayman Labib, 17 years old, was asked to remove, he is a student in the school, he was asked to remove his cross. When he refused, his teacher and the student beat him to death. Just yesterday, in the remembered day of October 9, 40 days of the memory, yesterday, over 30 people was hurt trying again to demonstrate in Maspero. That's happened just yesterday. We talk about Iraq. I visited Iraq 2 months ago. In my visit to Iraq, I was accompanied by one member of the Canadian Parliament, Mr. John Weston, and one member of the Canadian Senate, Don Meredith, as observants in my mission, and they was part of my delegation. I was able to visit with the Vice Prime Minister of Iraq, the Vice President, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Human Rights in Iraq. By the way, in any country, if you found a Minister for Human Rights, that means that they have no human right at all. That just is a rules, more or less. So, the difficult part that I found in Iraq is the massacre that facing the minorities, not just the Christians, but the minorities in general. Right now, the Christians in Iraq, half of the Christians in Iraq was forced to leave or was killed. This is a massacre, this is a genocide, this is not just ethnic cleansing, this is a genocide when you are forcing half of the community to be killed or to leave your land. And I visited a church by the name Our Lady of Salvation, is a Catholic church that was in October last year, was attacked by 5 terrorists. They entered the church, over 54 people was killed. 4 hours, the Iraqi police did not interfere to save these people's life. 4 hours. I met with some of the victims. Mr. Chair, what I'm holding here is the bullets from the bombs and the shooting that took place in Our Lady of Salvation. Some of them still have blood on from the victims. When the police entered after 4 hours on Our Lady of Salvation, the police did not, I repeat, the Iraqi police did not help the wounds. In the opposite, they start to take the gold and the money from the pockets of the victims. And I have an eyewitness, and I spoke with the priest of Our Lady of Salvation. And not only the Christians that facing persecution, I will mention as well the Sabaean and Mandeans and the Yazidis. The Sabaeans and Mandeans, there was 50 to 60,000 in the country. Now there are 3,500 to 7,000 of them. The solution, and I know that I have 5 minutes, the solution, thank you, Mr. Chair. The solution, and if you read my written statement, there is many solutions that we proposed, but because the time, I will just focus on one of them, connecting the American aid and the international trade with the improvement of the human rights situation or record in these countries. I don't know until when we'll keep giving them blank checks. I don't know until when we keep giving the American people money to the people that cause all of these crimes. This is not the government money. This is the American people money. Right now, in October 10, the Secretary of the State, Hillary Clinton, she indicated that they will continue supporting the Egyptian military. Now, United States, they give $1.9 billion to $2 billion to Egypt. 1.3 of them is military aid. And she said, and this was written in the website of the State Department, that they will continue supporting the military. Are the military who killed innocents, who killed the minority. The Iraqi government asking for $2 billion for security sections, and United States is, according to the media, that they are willing to give them this money. The Secretary of the State Department, in October 11, the day after the massacre, she had a phone call with Mohammed Amr, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Egypt, and she supported him, or she encouraged an investigation that made by the army. Now, can you explain to me how come the army investigate itself if they are the criminals? And here, the White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, he issued a statement that the president is deeply concerned about the violence in Egypt that led to tragic loss of life among demonstrators and security forces. The American president is concerned. It was a massacre. Concerning is not really did anything to the people on the ground. And in the same time, they said, demonstrate that he feels the tragic loss, he feels sorry for the tragic loss of the life among demonstrators and security forces. You make them equal. When you put the demonstrators and the security forces that was firing on them, you made them equal. You made both of them victims. No, one is the persecuted and one is the persecutors. Do not give them the same moral equality in your press release. Mr. Chair, forgive me for taking a very long time from you. In closing, Mr. Chair, the reason that I'm very passionate, I am not just the head of my organization or NGO. I used to be a prisoner. Until now, if I took off my jacket, you would found scars on my body. Until now, I have nightmares in the night from the torture that I saw. But, Mr. Chair, there is only one thing that I know in the middle of all of this. I know that the persecuted people of belief and faith is dying, but they're still smiling. They are in very deep, dark night, but they still have the candle of hope. I know by fact that our enemy, the enemy of democracy and freedom, have very strong army, have very strong weapon, but we have the Lord Almighty. I know for fact that they can always kill the dreamer, but no one can kill the dream. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. El-Shafi, thank you, Reverend,
Thank you, sir.
for that very powerful testimony.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to now yield to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Payne, distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to be asked to bring perspective on the important matter of religious freedom, especially as it relates to sub-Saharan African context. I appreciate the work that's been, the very important and vital work that's been done by this committee and by the State Department and the Commission on this very important topic. I'd like to summarize and ask that the written testimony be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The first thing I'd like to say, Mr. Chairman, is that I'd like to draw attention to a broader range of government intimidation and coercion of the religious sector, which is really on a less severe scale than many of the countries that are designated as CPC countries. But religious repression exists in multiple African countries where civil and political freedoms have been significantly constricted in general. And I'd like to suggest that some of these cases may help to ground the U.S. discussion on religious freedom in slightly broader perspective, not to take anything away from the urgency of the cases that have been legitimately at the center of the discussion, but I believe that the issue of religious freedom transcends some of the ways that it typically is discussed in official circles. One poignant example from the African context is Zimbabwe, ruled by Robert Mugabe for 31 years. Mr. Mugabe's repressive response to challenges to his continued rule have been well documented, but less well known has been his targeting of the religious community. Especially during the past several years, the Mugabe regime has unleashed violence on church persons or intimidated them by other means for being insufficiently supportive of his leadership and his ZANU-PF political party, or because they supported the leadership of his political rival, Morgan Tsvangirai, who has been in a power-sharing arrangement with Mugabe since 2009. For example, persons affiliated with the Johani Masawe Apostolic Church, one of Zimbabwe's largest denominations at roughly 1 million members, have been murdered, tortured, assaulted, or arrested, primarily because of their political inclinations and disinclinations. One church leader, a prophet Patrick of Machaya, was purportedly killed for not allowing access to his church for campaign meetings by ZANU-PF. 2 other church members were beaten to death in 2008, including the son of a church leader. The homestead of a church leader, Prophet Obi Mapurunga, was burned down for supporting Tsvangirai's MDC political party. Another church leader, Prophet Wanegi, was beaten, tortured, and his home burned down for supporting the MDC party. Yet another church leader, Apostle Harrison Chimutsimihu, was beaten and tortured for attending church on Friday rather than ZANU-PF campaign meetings. There are also quite a few additional instances reported of church members who were beaten, tortured, or detained for presumed disloyalty to ZANU-PF. Mugabe's demands for allegiance have been forcefully imposed on other churches and church leaders as well. A Catholic priest was arrested in April 2011 for holding a memorial service in remembrance of 20,000 Zimbabweans from the Ndebele ethnic group massacred by Mugabe's troops shortly after he came to power in 1980. The priest was charged with, quote, communicating false statements against the state, close quote, by referring to the killings and stirring, quote, offense to a particular tribe, close quote. In another 2011 incident, police in Harare used tear gas to disperse groups of church persons gathered for a peace vigil. 13 of the worshipers were arrested, including 4 clergymen, on charges related to fomenting public violence. But there's been a particularly systematic effort to politically reorient, if not expel, the majority of the Anglican Church in Zimbabwe, a church that has been a consistent promoter of political reform. When the former head of the Anglican Church in Zimbabwe, a pro-Mugabe bishop named Norbert Kanunga, was excommunicated by the church in 2007 for inciting violence through his sermons, he and his followers took over the main cathedral, the church's bank accounts, and dozens of Anglican schools and properties with the help of Mugabe's police force. Meanwhile, it's reported that the Anglican majority in Zimbabwe are being prevented by Bishop Kanunga and his followers, with the assistance from the police, from accessing many of their church buildings in various parts of the country. Where access to church buildings may still exist, priests and church leaders have been arrested with some regularity and held in jail over weekends so as to prevent them from holding worship services. Anglican bishops have received death threats. An elderly Anglican member was found murdered after repeatedly refusing demands to join Bishop Kanunga's church. The result of these repressive measures is that many Anglican churches lie empty on Sundays. These and other intimidation attacks were reported in the media and itemized in a report delivered to Mr. Mugabe in October 2011 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who traveled to Zimbabwe for an urgent meeting with Mr. Mugabe. Another country where the government has curtailed religious freedom through intimidation and coercion is Cameroon, a country ruled by the same president, Paul Biya, for 29 years. The country engages in periodic multi-party elections and has a constitution that enshrines civil liberties and religious freedom. Nevertheless, the power of Biya's regime is essentially without challenge, and the regime's capacity for manipulating or cowing opposition is extensive. The religious sector has not been especially politicized within post-colonial Cameroon, but in recent decades, there has been a cadre of religious leaders that have openly criticized the Biya regime for policies and practices that continue to mire the country in poverty, especially the Anglophone population, as well as in a culture of corruption. One of the most consistent critics has been Christian Toomey, a Roman Catholic cardinal, whose outspokenness has sometimes encouraged other Catholic leaders to speak out, though apparently not without consequences. Cardinal Toomey has endured death threats, government surveillance, and the Catholic radio station, Catholic Radio Veritas, was banned. Also, in the last 25 years, a number of Catholic religious leaders have been killed in Cameroon under suspicious circumstances. I itemized the names and the locations of these Catholic leaders. It includes 7 priests, 2 nuns, and 1 archbishop. Pope John Paul II in 1995 asked the Cameroonian government to investigate these unsolved deaths of Catholic clergy and religious leaders, but his request did not produce results. Nevertheless, according to a 2009 report on challenges faced by churches in Cameroon, quote, Catholics are broadly convinced these killings were an effort to intimidate the church to keep it out of politics. As startling as these killings are, the numbers still pale in comparison to the scale of religious violence in countries such as Sudan, Eritrea, and Nigeria, which partly explains why Cameroon and countries like it have not received as much attention in discussions of religious freedom. What also explains Cameroon's omission is the difficulty of seeing past constitutional and governmental declarations of religious freedom to the actual constrictions and constraints endured by religious communities on the ground. Let me skip, Mr. Chairman, to a second point that I really want to make in the remarks, which we can return to the other point in question and answer session. I'd like to suggest that there are a number of factors, including social inequality, interethnic grievances, and governmental manipulation that contribute to interreligious conflicts and demand attention and efforts to resolve these conflicts. Religion features prominently in religiously explicit forms of mediation, I think, are very much required in trying to mediate these. And so the second point I'd like to make is to emphasize the important role interdenominational and interfaith organizations should increasingly play in mediating these conflicts. The All-Africa Conference of Churches is an ecclesiastical network extending across sub-Saharan Africa that is developing ever stronger partnerships with national and regional councils of churches and with the African Union on social development matters, but also on peacemaking, which is its primary objective, especially in Sudan, the Great Lakes, and the Horn of Africa. Also, each region in Africa has a regional fellowship of Christian councils and churches, and there are at least 2 regional interfaith networks in Africa. Both of those are located in East Africa. Moreover, national church councils and interfaith councils exist in many African countries, including Sudan, Nigeria, and Eritrea. Although the impact of these various types of councils on conflict resolution has been debated, and the impartiality and diplomatic skill sets of religious leaders questioned at times, some of these councils have been very strategic to mediation and peacemaking. These religious councils have demonstrated a number of significant strengths that uniquely position them for effective mediation and peacemaking, including extensive, deep-rooted relationships with localized constituencies and situations where there oftentimes is a scarcity of local civil society infrastructure, capabilities to reach beyond culturally confined localisms and politically constricted local contexts so as to facilitate broader collaborative platforms for expression and action. And thirdly, an ability to speak to religious struggles with the religious authority that comes from theologically and ecclesiastically positioning responses to social problems. In building consensus around the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Sudan, the Sudan Council of Churches, the Sudan Catholic Bishops' Conference, and the Sudan Interreligious Council worked systematically to increase support for CPA among their local constituencies and to leverage local pressure on governmental parties, while deriving support from regional and international religious councils in the form of material resources, insertions of skilled personnel, and leveraging of pressure from other governments and multilateral organizations in support of CPA. But without the credibility local councils had with their Sudanese constituencies across denominational and religious lines, the external support for CPA may not have been sufficient to keep the process from collapsing. These local, regional, and international faith-based collaborations are continuing to evolve in East Africa in response to ongoing problems in Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, and elsewhere. The Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, for example, a multilateral interfaith initiative involving faith leaders from various denominational and conciliar bodies, as well as staff from the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, are facilitating broad-based dialogue, research, and training in response to conflicts in the region. With increased capacity, the contributions by these religious councils to mediation and peacemaking can be expanded. Unfortunately, expanding mediation and peacemaking activities of religious organizations seemingly has not been a U.S. foreign policy priority. There has been a policy interest in faith-based organizations within the context of the AIDS relief prioritizations within U.S. Africa policy, but very little attention to the strategic positioning of faith-based organizations for crucial mediation and peacemaking work. So my recommendation is that more attention be given within the overall government strategy to utilizing and helping to expand the mediation and peacemaking capacities of religious councils. To cite one other piece of information related to this, Mr. Chairman, the PEPFAR program, as you know, is the most extensive operation that the U.S. government has affecting African countries, with $15 billion allocated in 2003 for dispersal over 5 years, and another $48 billion allocated in reauthorization in 2008. 10% of those monies went to FBOs, faith-based organizations, but only $220 million has been allocated in the USAID's 2008 budget for democratic reform. So the very real gap between the monies allocated toward PEPFAR versus the monies allocated for democratic reform, in which many of these interfaith and interdenominational groups could play a role in mediation and reconciliation work, is underfunded and certainly needs to have more attention. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for allowing me to share a few perspectives on these issues.
Dr. Smith, thank you so very much for your testimony and for bringing very close scrutiny on the issue in Cameroon, which this committee is deeply concerned about, but you have highlighted that, particularly with your listing of the priests and nuns and bishop who have been killed there. We have not spent, frankly, enough time on this committee focusing on that in Cameroon, so I thank you for that and for the other very fine points that you made.
Thank you,
Mr. Payne does have to leave, so I would like to yield to him first, if he could.
Great. Thank you very much. I have, unfortunately, several members been waiting for me for about a half an hour. That's so I really have to leave. But let me just thank all of you for your testimony. The situation must improve. I just might ask you, Dr. Smith, it seems like it's a new phenomenon so far as I know, that the extremists that there has always been this conflict in Africa. However, it seems to me to be only in the last decade or less even that we've seen this question, a phenomenon of suicide bombing. This was not African. I mean, they might have been at war, but this, as we've seen in Somalia now and in even in Nigeria, we've seen this phenomena of of suicide bombing. And I wonder, and they're doing it under these people who are taking advantage of Islam. Have you, do you know when this change occurred, and have you noticed the fact that there is an increase in that when in the past it seemed to have been absent?
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I can't date the exact time in which that form of activity gained the kind of prominence that it has. I would say in response to your question that one of the things that is important to note in the discussion of religious freedom and the denials and the declines of religious freedom in many contexts is the extent to which governments and opportunistic groups can manipulate perspectives and ongoing grievances within context and move them in directions that had not necessarily been the role religion played within those particular contexts. So in these countries and where these types of activities, the suicide bombing activities are taking place, that would certainly be an instance where these situations of religion are being manipulated by non-religious groups who really have issues in mind and concerns in mind that are not specific to the religious community, manipulating religion for purposes that are political in nature. So I don't think that you would necessarily find that kind of activity taking place in countries that are not border countries to the Islamic world, where some of these things have occurred with more frequency. The ability of governments and other groups to manipulate that particular factor would probably be far less in countries where it's not been an inherent part of the culture, or at least a growing part of sort of the cultural milieu within those contexts.
And you raise a point about comparing the amount of funds that we have for PEPFAR and the very small amount for democracy and public diplomacy. So in your view, what is the role of public diplomacy in promoting religious freedom? And I think it's clear from your previous comments, but is the U.S. doing enough to work with indigenous, community-based, interreligious mediation organizations such as the internationally acclaimed Interfaith Mediation Center, headed by Imam Muhammad Asafar, and the Pastor James Woya in Nigeria?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Payne. No, in the short answer to the question is that I don't believe enough is being done to engage the very vital resources, both in terms of moral resources, relational resources, and infrastructural resources that are embodied by interfaith groups, interdenominational councils across the African continent and other places, undoubtedly. But certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very rich network, a very rich infrastructure of these organizations. As I mentioned, there are not only local councils, both interfaith and interdenominational within many countries, but there are regional councils in every region of Africa, east, west, southern, and the Horn and the Great Lakes region. There is also the All-Africa Conference of Churches, which is continental-wide in its impact and its involvement on various issues, particularly peacemaking issues. So there are significant resources and possibilities for involvement by these structures and by these religious leaders to engage in the very important work of mediation and reconciliation and peacemaking within these contexts. Not all of these situations of religious conflict are necessarily susceptible to government mediation or more hard demonstrations of hard power. Some of these situations can not only be perhaps prevented or mediated in some way by more soft power diplomacy skills. And I think that's precisely what these faith leaders and faith organizations can bring to the table. They have credibility with local populations. It's been demonstrated in a number of instances. The All-Africa Conference of Churches has worked very closely with the African Religious Leaders Council in East Africa on an interfaith dialogue related to Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia. The AACC and the Africa Religious Peace Council has also worked closely with the Africa Union, who understands the importance of those infrastructures and those leaders to the mediation process, to the peacemaking process. Africa Union combined efforts with the Africa Religious Peace Council in the Abuja Initiative, a dialogue that took place not too long ago to bring faith leaders around the table to discuss the issues of religious violence in Nigeria. So I think Africa Union is demonstrating, and as well as IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the importance that they place on the religious community for mediation and peacemaking. I think that the U.S. government, through the State Department and through other mechanisms, can make much better use of those resources.
Thank you very much. I just want to appreciate your comments, and since time is short, I won't ask any other questions, but I do want to say to Reverend Shafi, I will be visiting Egypt in the next week or so, and I will look at your testimony and raise some issues with the authorities there. Although it's not on the agenda, we're there to observe the elections coming up. But I think that these issues are important, and if we get an opportunity to, and I know there'll be an opportunity to be before some of the government authorities, I will certainly raise these issues. And secondly, if you have any other issues you'd like to highlight, I will be leaving tomorrow's the last day, but you certainly can feel free to get anything to my office. But I do have your testimony in full that I will review and will take points from that. So
Thank you, sir.
thank you very much. Let me thank all of you. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Let me just ask some questions. Thank you, all four of you, for your very, very incisive testimony. Bishop Ramirez, in your testimony, you, I think, provide a very robust and rich and deep definition of religious freedom. When the church speaks, you write about religious freedom, it's not arguing solely for freedom from coercion in matters of personal faith and conscience. It is also advocating for freedom to practice faith individually and communally in both private and public. Freedom of religion extends beyond freedom of worship to include the institutional freedom of the church and religious organizations to provide education, health, and other social services, and then goes on from there. You also point out some very disturbing Pew studies that shows that 70% of the world's population have high or very high governmental or societal restrictions on religion. And you point out most ominously that as recently as August 2011, a Pew study found that between 2006 and 2009, in some of the most populous countries affecting about a third of the world's population, that China, Egypt, France, Nigeria, Russia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the United Kingdom, as 8 countries where government or societal restrictions increased substantially, while religious restrictions in countries such as India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iran, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and Burma remain very high. I mean, a very serious erosion of religious freedom that you've highlighted, which I think has been underscored by each of our witnesses. But I thank you for giving that broad sweep of the world. I don't think we're doing enough. I don't think Congress is doing enough. The fact that the Commission has been stymied over on the Senate side thus far underscores a lack of prioritization. And I think your point and others' points about the administration more fully integrating the religious freedom message in all of its rich manifestations has not happened so far. Hope springs eternal. Hopefully they will, but it has not happened in my view. If I could specifically on Iraq, because I know the church, all the churches, have been extremely concerned about what happens when U.S. and coalition forces leave. It has been a dismal record while we were there. What happens when we leave? Do you have any recommendations, any of you, perhaps Bishop Ramirez, starting with you, on what we ought to be doing to ensure that as the baton is passed, the situation does not deteriorate further.
I mentioned in my testimony, my oral testimony, that we had two bishops visit Iraq just very recently. 2 weeks ago, they were there. And they were pressed by the Christians whom they visited that they're concerned about what would happen, what will happen when the U.S. troops leave. Will there be any kind of protection? So we would hope that the U.S. would continue to monitor the situation and provide as much assistance as it can. On the issue of what actions the President and the State Department could take against some of these countries that are egregious violators of religious freedom, some of these we might suggest are something like travel restrictions for some of the government leaders, arms sales, a restriction of arms sales to those countries, the sales of material that might eventually be used for torture. When I was in the commission, we made an issue of that in certain countries, that we not export certain material that could eventually be used as torture. Also, perhaps economic sanctions aimed not at everybody in that country, but especially at the elite, so that we wouldn't hurt the vulnerable people in the particular country. So we do have those recommendations to make, and we would reinforce the recommendations of the Commission on taking these various actions on behalf of the President and the State Department.
Thank you very much. If I, yes,
No.
if you wanted to touch on that, please.
Okay. No, when I visited Iraq, Mr. Chair, the major thing that took my attention is that the Iraqi government completely trying to blame Syria, the old regime, but they wouldn't touch on the persecution that's happening to the Christians there. They wouldn't touch on Iran. The major thing that took my attention is the increase of influence of the Iranian regime in Iraq. Let me put it in a very simple way. I spoke with one of the Iraqi officials in Iraq who indicated to me in private, I will not mention his name to protect him, but with me was one MP and one senator that was witness on the conversation, John Weston and Don Meredith, that when the Iraqi government choose a minister in Iraq, the Iranian regime have to approve it first. That's what's said to me in front of a Canadian member of parliament and a Canadian senator from very high official Iraqi. Now, here is the problem with that. If United States did not prevent Iran from taking over Iraq or to have an absolute increase of influence in Iran, as we can see, even Gish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army, which is very responsible directly on the persecution of a lot of Christians in Iraq, such as Atrak Ryakos, who was kidnapped and tortured by them, and now he's 20 years old. He cannot even walk because they broke his back. Gish al-Mahdi now, they start to integrate them in the Iraqi government. The influence of Iran is increasing. And here is the problem, Mr. Chair. United States, more than any other country in the world, paid very heavy price to free Iraq from dictatorship. To be exact, around 5,000 American soldiers, around 32 American soldiers was wounded, 5,000, almost 5,000 American soldiers was killed. I will not even talk to you about the finance that United States put in Iraq. I will talk to you about the blood, because the blood, you cannot replace it. Money you can, blood you can't. Mr. Chair, if we did not protect the Christians in Iraq, if we did not prevent Iran from increasing their influence in Iraq, our American soldiers, our American children, their blood will go in vain. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers, if I could ask you, I know you recently visited Pyongyang with Lord Alton and Baroness Cox. As a matter of fact, I was in email contact with Lord Alton prior to his traveling there most recently. Could you give us, you mentioned 200,000 people in camps. There's one show church, I understand, in Pyongyang, and if that's still up and running. What is the state of religious persecution in that hermit kingdom?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just before I answer that question, could I correct one omission from my oral testimony where I neglected formally to request that my written testimony be included?
Without objection, all of the
Thank-
testimonies will be part of the record.
Thank you very much. In answer to your question, I think one can say about North Korea, and it's not something that one can say about too many countries, that there is no religious freedom in North Korea. There are actually 3 show churches in Pyongyang, one Protestant, one Russian Orthodox, and one Roman Catholic, and we did visit all 3 of them. But I think it's fair to say that all 3 of them are show churches. The Catholic Church in particular is, the other 2 churches have a veneer which can be deceptive. The Catholic Church has clearly no veneer because it does not have a priest. And we've raised this consistently with the North Korean authorities that there is no Catholic priest in the Catholic Church in Pyongyang. Instead, there is actually a party cadre who looks almost like a stereotypical party cadre in a Mao suit with not even much of a smile. So the situation there was really, they were Potemkin-style show churches. Outside Pyongyang, to my knowledge, there are no churches permitted by the authorities. We believe that there are gatherings of Christians who meet at significant risk. If they are caught, it's my understanding that anyone engaged in religious activity ends up in one of the prison camps. And in some cases, not all, but some cases they face execution for their religious faith and activities, and particularly anybody who has been repatriated by China, people who've gone across the border to China, perhaps converted in China or had contact with South Korean Christian missionaries in China. If that is discovered, or if they're discovered bringing Bibles back into North Korea, they face death or certainly extremely severe penalties. And just one final point in relation to China's policy of repatriation, I think that is a really serious situation that so far the international community, including the United States, has failed to properly address with China. And I would want pressure to be put on China to stop repatriating North Koreans, some of whom are Christians and some of whom face severe penalties and violations of religious freedom.
Thank you very much. I know Bishop Ramirez, I believe you have to leave for a flight. So I thank you on behalf of the committee for your testimony and very wise counsel and insights. Thank you. Just a few final questions. I know it is getting late, and we will submit some additional questions if you would, as quickly as you can, turn those answers around. Reverend El Shafi, if I could just add and reiterate something you mentioned earlier that I found outrageous as well. When on October 10th, the President of the United States said that he is deeply concerned, or the White House said, the President is deeply concerned about the violence in Egypt that has led to a tragic loss of life. Now that's fine, of course. Now is the time for restraint on all sides so that Egyptians can move forward and forge a strong and united Egypt, clearly conveying a equality of culpability on both sides as if there weren't a victim and an aggressor. Your point was, I think, very well taken. It's something that I raised as well. There is an aggressor, and matter of fact, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, routinely come here and to the Pentagon, and to the best of my knowledge, we're saying investigate, but investigate yourself. It does raise very serious questions about credibility, and I do think it's time to look at that 1.3 billion and all money flowing to the country of Egypt because of this heightened crackdown on the Coptic Christians as well as other religious minorities, but no one seems to be suffering more than the Copts. So your points, I think, were very, very well taken. Dr. Smith, with regard...
Mr. Chair, can I just add
sure.
one point before we move? Sorry, forgive me for interrupting you. I found it very concerning that this administration is missing the care and missing the real action when it comes to freedom of religion. I'm not just talking about with Egypt or the Arab Spring. Well, you cannot expect that there is a democracy between day and night there. Basically, without education, democracy dies. 30 to 40% of the Egyptian population is illiterate. That means that they cannot read and write their own name. So no matter how much you reform the constitution, they still will not understand what is in it. So you have to start by education before you start by democracy. The support that some of the people that in this administration, that they believe that Muslim Brotherhood is a peaceful organization, that's shocking to me. Muslim Brotherhood is the foundation of Al-Qaeda, of Hamas, of Hezbollah, and some of them talking with them, like, isn't our Secretary of State went to meet with them in Cairo, and after the meeting, they came out of the meeting and they completely dismissed her. They actually spoke about her with disrespect. And not only Egypt or Iraq, Mr. Chair, but even in Iran. When President Obama gave his speech in Cairo in June 2009, a week later, the Green Revolution started in Tehran, and nobody did anything from the American administration, and this is a fact. The fact that we cannot even stand against China. We know that China is killing the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong and the Christians and the Tibetan, and we cannot do anything because our financial and our economic depend on them. The truth and the reality that even the ambassador at large, Ms. Susan Cook, is not here, that still uses something. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just a couple final questions. Dr. Smith, the Department of State seems to view the North-South conflict in Nigeria as primarily political in nature and not religious. Do you agree with that, and why or why not?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that clearly there are more than religious dimensions to the conflict, but religion is also, I think, a verifiable part of the conflict. One of the things that I think is important to do in order to, because there are clearly tensions within official circles about where the conversation on religious freedom fits with overall U.S. government policy in various parts of the world. And I think it's important that as we pursue the conversation on religious freedom, that we are careful to emphasize not only the religious freedom dimensions, but to emphasize those within a larger conversation about denial of civil liberties and political freedoms in general. I think to tie the religious freedom discussion to a very, very clear and detailed concern about impediments to religious, or to freedom of expression, impediments to freedom of assembly, gives the religious freedom discussion a kind of breadth. And in the Nigerian context, I think it's quite important in a context, and Nigeria would not be the only African context where there are some concerns about the real agenda behind the discussion of religious freedom. I think in a number of African contexts there are concerns that that the way religious freedom is being discussed, it is being discussed as sort of an extension of the global war on terror, or perhaps even as an extension of the ecclesiastical expansion concerns of American churches, proselytizing concerns of American churches. I think to tie the religious freedom discussion more closely to these very real and legitimate political and civil liberties issues helps to ground the discussion so that we don't have the kind of pushback on religious freedom issues. Clearly, Nigeria is about more than just the religious freedom issue, but is very much a part of the conversation as well.
If you could, on Eritrea, we know that some Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses have been locked into containers and have died when put out into the desert. How widespread is that? We know others have been killed, obviously, in jail and tortured to death. And who has leverage with the Eritreans, with their leadership?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, unfortunately, with the Eritrean situation, what we have is a context of virtually a failed state. A failed state and the virtual absence of a civil society sector. And so, in the absence of any kind of civil society groups that can really challenge the government on these issues, I think that the situation is bound to continuing to grow worse. The pressure, I think, will have to come from outside of Eritrea to a great extent, not necessarily outside the continent or outside the region.
Like the AU?
Like the AU, and like some of these regional and continent-wide interfaith and interdenominational groups, as well as government, U.S. government, European government pressures on the Eritrean situation. There's virtually little that's going on inside of Eritrea that's going to provide the pushback that's needed.
You know, Bishop Ramirez said, and I meant to ask him before he left, that the greatest number of religious persecutions and discriminatory activities is directed at Christians. Would you all agree with that in terms of numbers?
Yes.
Yes, I would.
Okay.
I think the numbers probably stack up that way.
And it's in his written testimony, so it is part of the record. Let me ask a couple of final questions before we conclude. Mr. Rogers, can you explain why you think concerns exist over the rule of law in Indonesia, and exactly what you saw when you visited GYI Yasmin Church in Bogor? And secondly, you mentioned new restrictions on religious freedom in the Kachin state in Burma. Maybe perhaps you could elaborate on that for the committee. And Reverend El Shafi, if I could ask you, we've focused in this committee in the past on the UNRWA textbooks that the Palestinian Authority uses that are rife with anti-Semitic statements as well as anti-American. And with the rise in Hamas, which was very much responsible for that anti-Semitic hatred, as well as anti-Christian and anti-American and anti-Israel, have you seen any abatement with any of that? Have you followed that closely at all? Because it seems to me, as has been said, and it's in the report that the Commission put out about the absolutely essential character of teaching. If you teach young people to hate, they will hate. And it's very hard to change that behavior when it's been so indoctrinated into a young man or a young woman. I remember in one of my previous hearings, we had a man from Saudi Arabia whose brother had been imprisoned, who brought the textbooks and read from them and said, this is what a little 8, 9, 10-year-old is subjected to in terms of hate formation. And I'm just wondering if you might want to speak to that as well. But Ben, if you could start, and then we go to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In relation to serious concerns over the rule of law in Indonesia, I think there are two clear examples that illustrate this. One is the GKI Yasmin case, which I'll come on to because you specifically referenced that. But the other is the trial earlier this year following a very brutal attack that I described very briefly in my opening statement, attack on the Ahmadiyya community in a town called Cikesik. A mob of more than 1,000 people attacked a community of 21. Of the perpetrators who carried out that attack, only 3 individuals were arrested and put on trial. During the trial, one of the Ahmadi survivors was subjected to the most extraordinary verbal harassment by the judge, and that's actually available on YouTube. It was captured on video. And the 3 perpetrators were sentenced, and these were people who'd carried out murder and other really, really seriously violent acts, were sentenced to between 3 and 6 months in jail. And one Ahmadi man who had simply been there to try to protect his community, he hadn't actually engaged in any violence, but he was sentenced to 6 months for disobeying police orders to leave his home. To me, that says something is wrong with the rule of law when people who carry out these kind of acts are receive those kind of light sentences. The case of GKI Yasmin Church also illustrates a breakdown in the rule of law, because this is a church that some years ago secured all the necessary permissions and licenses to set up as a church. The local mayor actually approved the construction of the church. The local mayor then came under pressure from extremist groups and reversed his decision. The church challenged this decision in the courts at every level, local court, district court, and all the way to the Supreme Court. At every stage, the court ruled in the church's favor, all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled that the church should be allowed to open, is legal, and the mayor is still refusing to allow it to open. When I visited the church for its Sunday service just a few weeks ago, they are worshipping in the street outside the church building because the church building is locked and sealed. They're surrounded by rows of police for their own protection because there's a mob of extremists the other side of the police. And it's the first time I've ever worshipped on a Sunday morning in the street surrounded by police who, in this particular case, were there to protect the congregation. But nevertheless, the church should be allowed to open, and it's now a rule of law issue because the mayor is in defiance of a Supreme Court ruling. In answer to the situation in Kachin, just in recent weeks, the Kachin are a predominantly Christian people along the border with China, and in recent weeks, Burma Army soldiers have attacked several churches. They shot at worshippers in an Assemblies of God church, injuring several people, including the pastor and a deacon. And they also seized control of a Catholic church where they shot at the congregation during a Sunday service and beat the priest's assistant with a rifle butt. They've introduced new regulations in one particular township. We don't know yet whether this is being applied in other parts of the country, but in one particular township in Kachin State, on the 14th of October, an order was sent requiring Christians to seek permission from the local authorities at least 15 days in advance, and with several letters of recommendation from government departments required 15 days in advance if they want to pray, read the Bible, carry out Bible studies, carry out Sunday school, or fast. I have never seen that in Burma before, that one should apply 15 days in advance simply to pray or read the Bible, but that is a new order in one locality at least.
Reverend.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, what we are seeing right now in the Palestinian territory is not only happening in Gaza, it's also happening in the Palestinian Authority areas, which is supposed to be the ones that less extremist in education. But what we're seeing right now in the Middle East when it comes to school books with regard the anti-Semitism and so on, is what we call it in One Free World International, the new kind of anti-Semitism. Now, the old kind of anti-Semitism is basically that you attack the Jewish because he is a Jewish person. So kill the Jewish or no Jewish allowed and all of the stuff. Now, the new anti-Semitism is not necessarily pointed at the Jewish people, but pointed at Israel, the existence of Israel as a nation and the people who live in it. Now, I'm not saying that we are not allowed to criticize Israel. Israel is a country like any country, have its good, have its bad, of course. But I'm saying once you cross this line of just useful criticizing to denying their existence or denying the right to defend itself, that's become anti-Semitism. That's become the new kind of anti-Semitism. That's in my opinion. And right now, we're seeing that this books, not only in the Palestinian areas, not only in the Palestinian territory, even in Egypt, for example, that a country that have a peace agreement with Israel for 32 years. So basically what we're seeing right now is what I can say is preparing a new generation for hatred and war. And the only solution that we can do right now with this regard is basically that our aid to aim more on the programs in these countries that basically will promote harmony and interfaith and will put some pressure on these governments to change these textbooks. And you are right, once the child learned this in his young age, sir, I need to tell you, when I was in Egypt 9 years old, I was in the school in Egypt. One day I went to my history teacher and I asked him, why do we hate Israel in the school books, in the history books, while we have peace agreement with them? I was 9 years old and I received 10 beating from a stick on my hand.
Just for asking.
Just for asking this question. And it took very long time to eradicate yourself and to understand the truth. But it's never too late. That's what I know. It's never too late to act now. Thank you.
You know, Natan Sharansky made a very famous speech in which he talked about how you recognize when it's not just disagreeing with an Israeli policy, and he calls it the 3 Ds of definition. The first is demonization of Israel, second, delegitimization, and the third, denial of Israel's right to exist. So it certainly comports with exactly what you just said.
What we're seeing right now in the Islamic faith, if I may, the biggest dilemma that Islam as a faith is facing is not rising of the extremists, but is the silence of the moderate Muslims. What I am really saying here is, don't say that, sir, can I be just not politically correct just for half a minute, and after that I will be politically correct again if you want to. What we are facing right now is when you sit down with a Muslim community that they're supposed to be re-educating their children and supposed to improve their ideas about Jewish people and Christians, they will ask from us not to judge them on the actions of the extremists. And they will tell me that the extremists did hijack the religion. Well, why did you let them hijack it? Isn't this a normal question? Why did you let it hijack it? Is not the dilemma of the Islamic faith is not the rising of the extremists, but the moderate Muslims who remain silent on the crime that happened to the Jewish and the Christians. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, I have one final question, and then any final comments any of the 3 of you would like to make. In your discussion about Cameroon, you point out that in the last 25 years, a number of Catholic leaders have been killed in Cameroon under suspicious circumstances, and you list a number of those who have died. If I'm reading it correctly, the last was in 2006, and in your statement, you say, according to a 2009 report on challenges faced by churches in Cameroon, quote, Catholics are broadly convinced these killings were an effort to intimidate the church to keep it out of politics. When you say were, do you mean, is it truly past tense, or is it past tense and present tense as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I definitely am alluding to the fact that it's an ongoing problem. In 2009, that was a report, and that was reported during that time. But when I was actually in Cameroon in 2010, I believe it was, as a Fulbright professor, the kinds of concerns that itemized in the report came out very clearly from many of the students, religious leaders around the country, about the ongoing intimidation, coercion, repression of Christian churches, particularly and also Muslim groups, particularly in the Anglophone section of Cameroon, which is the least developed part of the country, sort of the minority population within the larger Francophone context. And the extent to which the national government has manipulated leaders even of religious communities within the Anglophone section as a means of suppressing the voices of resistance was quite extensive, and to the point that I think many of the religious leadership that I spoke with felt that they had very little ability to truly express their point of view, their interests, their concerns, and in some respects even to truly express matters that they felt were at the heart of their faith experience, that their religious experience was not just an individualistic concern. Their religious experience was about community and the abilities of community to be able to form freely and to represent and embody the interests of constituencies that they represent.
Any final comments from any of our witnesses? Yes, Ben.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to firstly thank you again very much, and other members for your leadership on this issue. I'd like to just make a couple of final points. On the positive side, coming from the United Kingdom, not being a US citizen and not being embroiled in the domestic politics of the United States, we really appreciate the United States leadership on the issue of international religious freedom, the leadership that you have given and other members of Congress, but also the leadership that the State Department and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom have given over the years. I think the United Kingdom is perhaps beginning to try to catch up, and others in Europe also. There was a recent conference in the United Kingdom on international religious freedom, and the new government, I think, is prioritizing it much more than they used to. But over the years, the United States has given this issue real leadership, which those of us who work on international religious freedom in other parts of the world deeply appreciate. However, in recent months, I think we've been very concerned by some of the trends in the United States, the serious delay in the nomination and appointment of the ambassador at large. It's concerning that the ambassador at large was not here today, and also the issues regarding the reauthorization of the Commission. And I hope very much that all those concerns that have arisen in recent months will be addressed, and that the United States will really continue and increase its important leadership on this very important issue.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One brief comment. First of all, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here and share perspectives on this important issue today, and I think it is a very important issue. I think that the ongoing work around religious freedom is vital, and the work of this committee, the work of the Commission, the work that other sectors of U.S. government is doing on this important topic. And I would hope that there would be ways to really have bipartisan cooperation around these issues, so that the important issue of religious freedom does not somehow get lost in the politics. And I think what I've tried to do here today is to suggest that that there are some mechanisms for bridging that may draw a wider level of support for the issue of religious freedom, not only within U.S. government conversations, but also with our partners around the world on these issues. And I think that one of those ways is to demonstrate that that religious freedom is an issue that transcends some of the kind of divisions that we have in our conversations about that, by situating that more in a larger conversation of civil liberties and political freedoms. Thank you.
On those fine comments, the hearing is adjourned.